welcome back to another Giant Slayer TFT Synergies Tier List video. Today our analysts will be ranking each synergy from S down to the C tier. We're well into the second patch of Set 4, and while there's still a lot of diversity because of the chosen mechanic, a few synergies definitely sit above the others. Overall, there's not too much of a power gap between most traits, as it really comes down to the specific game you're in. And as we said, the chosen mechanic really adds a lot of depth to builds, so don't overlook lower tier synergies too much, as they can also be viable. Just as a heads up, there is a B patch being launched today. This video was recorded before the launch of that B patch. With all that said, let's dive on in. But before we begin, please don't forget to click the links in our description. Give your support to everyone who helped make this video happen. We host many TFT tournaments with plenty of exciting content to come, so be sure to also follow our Giant Slayer TFT social media pages. Alright, let's get back to the video. To start off the tier list, we have the synergies in the S tier. This consists of Spirit, Dusk, Mystic, Tormented, and Moonlight. Basically, these traits are at the tippity top of the meta and can be used to earn you a consistent top 4 placement. They are usually highly contested, so keep that in mind during your games. Up first is Spirit. Spirit enables several top meta compositions such as Aphelios or Shade, and Ahri in general is one of the best current champions. You're likely going to see Spirit contested every single game by multiple players, and for good reason. The attack speed buff it provides, especially due to Ahri, is way too good for enabling certain champions and traits. Another benefit to Spirit is that you can run a wide array of synergies in conjunction with the champions. Hunter, for example, pairs well because of Kindred. Mystic is a super easy splash in with Yuumi. 3 Mages isn't exactly that great, but it is possible to play that when you're running Ahri. All of this combined makes Spirit not only useful because of the synergies effect, but also the amount of flexibilities its champions provide. But as we mentioned, it is highly contested, so be diligent when scouting. Ahri is the most important Spirit to grab, so don't commit to a build you can't pivot out of if too many players are already playing Ahri. Next up is Dusk. Dusk is similar to Spirit in the sense that it really works well with a wide assortment of synergies. The main reason for this is that the Dusk buff is always useful with its 20% spell power increase for all of your champions. Everything scales with spell power in some way or another, so even if you're not going into a magic damage focused build, you can still use 2 Dusk as a splash trait. That said, you're not often going to rely on just 2 Dusk to do well. The synergy truly shines when you're hitting 4 Dusk and really pops off if you can get 6 Dusk in either a chosen Dusk or a spatula item. Riven is the largest reason for this synergy's success, as she's just an all-around great champion. Besides her, you have Cassiopeia, a unit with a strong ultimate, and also you can easily splash in Mystic. So whether you're running 2, 4, or 6 Dusk, this synergy is going to be quite strong to play. As we mentioned it a few times, let's talk about Mystic. Mystic may not matter too much when champions like Ahri do a 2000 damage critical hit, but overall the magic resistant increase for your whole team is insanely good. There's not really much else to be said about this synergy, as having a team-wide buff is generally good, and there's a ton of magic damage in Set 4. Combine those, and you have a top-tier splash trait. The next synergy is for Kayn, and we're talking about Tormented. Kayn is still one of the best late-game legendary champions that you can play, even on his own without Shade. Add him in with Shade and that composition is going to do quite well. Tormented then comes into play after 3 rounds and you can buff your Kayn significantly with either healing or extra damage. So yeah, even though it's a solo trait, it's incredibly good. And our last S tier trait is Moonlight. Moonlight can struggle heavily unless you get lucky enough to find a Moonlight chosen. But we had to place this trait in the S tier because of just how dominant Aphelios is right now, and he's enabled by the Moonlight trait along with Spirit, of course. Moonlight opens the door for having a 4-star carry, which means a 2-cost champion like Aphelios that would eventually fall off even at 3 stars can keep carrying into the late game as a 4-star. Pair this trait with Spirit and you have one of the best, if not the best, compositions in the current meta. Let's move on to the synergies in the A tier. This consists of the Boss, Shade, Hunter, Cultist, Brawler, Elderwood, Fortune, Mage, and Vanguard. Basically, these synergies are often paired with the S tier traits or do well on their own in the meta, making them a consistent choice. First up is the Boss, or we can call it the Set trait. Okay, so Set isn't as good in the current meta as he was during 1019, and that's really due to a shift in the meta. It went from a lot of beefy frontline champions to things like Ahri frontline or 1 or 2 Vanguards in the frontline. Since his damage partially comes from the enemy health, it's hurt his overall impact in the game. That said, he's still one of the best late game champions and should definitely be picked up, especially if you can 2-star him. Just keep in mind that he may struggle against certain meta compositions like Aphelios. Moving along, we have Shade. Shade is another trait that gets paired well with Spirit, as the attack speed buff on Zed makes him an insanely good carry. You also get access to the backline because of Shade, making it valuable against builds like Aphelios, and your Zed won't get killed right away due to the invisible effect of the trait. Overall, it's a solid choice in the meta, but does rely on a bit of luck in finding either a Z3 or Kane 2. Hunter isn't the best synergy on its own, but it does buff both Aphelios and Ashe, which makes it valuable in the current meta. The main thing to remember when using Hunter is not to commit to it past 3, as there's not really much benefit to running 4 or 5 Hunter. Cultist is going strong as a top tier early game trait. Later on it can fall off rather harshly, but the value comes from the health you save during stage 2 and 3. If you find a chosen cultist, you can sit back and enjoy your free win streak throughout stage 2. Unfortunately, brawlers have fallen off a bit in the current meta. Ashe Brawler is still doing okay, but just having extra health doesn't always cut it against champions like Aphelios that are fine with fights being extended. Overall, it's still doing well because it's one of the best frontline focused traits. Another defensive trait to consider is Elderwood. Elderwood is currently rising in popularity as the armor and magic resistance can be incredibly useful in the current meta. Along with that, you can commit to Vanguard as a carry as well as the still very strong Ashe. Surprisingly, Fortune is making a splash in the meta, and for good reason, as the buffs to the average value you receive from the loot drops has made it much more consistent. Even if you win every round, you're still getting good value, but losing a few and cashing in on it with a win is insanely valuable. Overall, we're not entirely sure where this trait should end up in the meta, but it's definitely much more valuable than it was in 1019. Mage is doing well right now, mainly because of Vanguard and to lesser extent, Ahri. Ahri is a top tier champion, but often doesn't need Mage, but she is a nice addition to the composition, especially for anyone running 6 Mage. But Vanguard is why the trait is truly shining, as his damage and scaling is fantastic. And the last A tier trait is Vanguard. Vanguard overall isn't that useful in terms of the armor it provides past the early game. This is due to the amount of magic damage in set 4 that just ignores the armor completely. However, the champions are quite good, such as Sejuani, Aatrox, Thresh, and in some cases Wukong. Basically, you're often going to see Vanguard used, but that's mainly because the champions are strong frontliners. Next up, we have the synergies in the B tier. This tier consists of Divine, Assassin, Enlightened, Duelist, Sharpshooter, Warlord, and Keeper. These are generally niche strategies that do well when you have a chosen champion of one of them. In those games, you can do well and often place in the top 4, but they aren't consistent enough to go for every game. First, we have Divine. 2 Divine is actually really good, but beyond that, the trait just doesn't provide much. This makes it hard to commit to a full build for it, but if you can get a Divine chosen Wukong, it does open the door to playing him as a semi-carry in Vanguard Mystic. Beyond that, Jax with a second Divine actually does fairly well into champions like Aphelios. Assassins are really hard to place right now in the meta. At times they do really well because of the abundance of squishy backline builds, but due to players cornering their main carry or simply running Ahri in their frontline, the assassin champions can sometimes struggle to do much. More or less the success of this trait depends entirely on the lobby. Going hand in hand with Assassin is Enlightened. The reason for that is Talon. Talon is the key champion to both traits, so having one means that you have the other. Beyond that, you're not likely to see Enlightened played that much, though Morgana as a secondary carry isn't bad if you can 3-star her, and Janna is just an amazing champion. Duelist is a lot like Cultist in that it does well early game with a chosen Yasuo, but it falls off hard after that unless you super commit to playing it, and even then the best place it can get with perfect conditions is 4th or 3rd. Basically, use it for the early game and only play it past then if you're naturally hitting a Yasuo 3. Sharpshooter is unfortunately not as consistent in 1020 as it was with Spirit in 1019. The main reason is that Jinx isn't as reliable anymore, and there's more compositions that easily disrupt your very squishy backline now. The synergy can still be okay, especially with Spirit, but don't rely on it for consistency. Warlord is the best example of a trait that shines brightly when you have a specific chosen for it. Katarina and to a lesser extent Xin Zhao can make this trait do quite well. Well enough for you to get a top 3, assuming that you can 3-star them. But most often you're going to see this trait used in the early game and then tossed aside, which is the case for a lot of the B tier synergies. Another early game trait is Keeper. Keeper is quite strong early on in the game, but the shields just don't scale well going into stage 4. So we recommend using it to save your health early on in the game and then pivot out of it as soon as you can. And now we're into the last tier of today, the C tier. This tier consists of Ninja, Dazzler, Exile, Emperor, and Adept. While these synergies can be useful in the right circumstance, they're just generally not that impactful for the majority of the games. Ninjas can do well, especially because Akali can be a main carry for assassins, but it's hard to ever commit to 4 ninja when you can just play the more consistent variation of assassin builds. That said, in the right circumstance, this trait does outperform the others in this tier by a fair amount, but the lack of consistency prevents it from moving up to the C tier and above. Dazzler is going to be played whenever you're running Enlightened because of Morgana, and in that situation, it can be useful. But it's also not that impactful of a trait most of the time, and rarely being used makes it a C tier trait at best. While Yasuo and Yone are both good champions in the right situation, Exile as a whole just is not that great of a synergy. Don't get us wrong though, as running 1 Exile is fine. It's a useful trait in the right situation, but Yasuo is mainly an early game champion, and Yone isn't really played much late game. So you have 2 situational champions with a trait you're likely never going to run 2 of. If Yone gets buffed, it's definitely possible that we'll see the value of this trait go up. Emperor is just really lackluster compared to the other solo synergies like the Boss and Tormented. Azir is an amazing champion, easily one of the best 5 costs, but the Emperor trait just doesn't provide a ton of value. And our last synergy for the tier list is Adept. Adept unfortunately gets hard countered by Quicksilver, and that item is one of the most commonly made items for carries at the moment. It gets value in slowing down the enemy team, but the main carry is fine due to the Quicksilver. That all said, it's a trait that you can splash in just because it only takes 2 champions, but don't rely on it for you to win games. And that is all we have for today's tier list video. While synergies like Spirit or Moonlight are dominating the meta, there's still a ton of diversity in what's playable because of the chosen mechanic. Let us know in the comment section below if you think any trade should be higher or lower on our list. Thank you for watching, and if you're enjoying our content, be sure to hit the like button and subscribe for future Giant Slayer TFT videos.